In Age of Empires 3 Definitive Edition there were quite a few new economic buildings added. Also existing buildings got a new economic bonus, and existing gather rates of economic buildings have been adjusted frequently. In this video I want to compare the different buildings and provide some insight on how good they are in supremacy and in a late game scenario. First off, I want to start with the methodology. Because buildings have different costs and provide different resources, we need to make them comparable. For this I typically use food equivalent, because the different resources are gathered at different speeds and are consequently valued differently. To illustrate my point, as an age-up, people generally rate 400 wood higher than 500 food, for example, or the 300 export shipment is on a similar power level than the 700 coin. I will blend in the exchange rates to food equivalent in this video, and you can also see the mini spreadsheet I linked below in the info box. To measure the usefulness of a card in supremacy, I calculated the economic break-even time with the following formula. Simplified, the break-even time is the time how long it takes until your investment into that building pays even and you start profiting from that investment. It is the food equivalent cost divided by the food equivalent gather rate, plus the build time for that building. The villager seconds, which is needed to build a building, is also included in this formula. I assume that you use one villager to build that building, except for buildings which gets constructed by a wagon or by the explorer. In this case, no villager seconds are spent and thus the cost doesn't increase for that building. For late game, the break-even time doesn't really matter, but rather how much of a bonus you can get in total. For this I assumed full upgrades and typical late game scenarios. In total I looked at 13 economic buildings, one that's excluded, and generated a placement in both categories. I added both placements and I generated a ranking out of it. Keep in mind, this ranking does not include the main use of a building, so providing population, a place to train units, or researching technologies provides a value on its own. It rather tries to answer the question if it's worth to build a building solely for the economy, or how big the impact is of the economic building in the late game. Now with everything covered, let's jump into the ranking. The last place gets the tavern. The tavern gives you a tiny bonus of only 0.6 coin per second. This together with a relative high cost of 200 wood means you need almost 7 minutes break-even time with this building. Also surprisingly, the build bonus with 20 XP is also smaller than that of most buildings, because it's only 10% of the cost, whereas most buildings give 20% of the cost as experience back. There is no late game scaling, except for USA and Mexico, but even then the total bonus is only marginally bigger than the coin trickle card Capitalism. So compare 1.8 versus 1.65 of Capitalism. And Capitalism is also not a card you typically use in late game decks. So the late game bonus is also tiny. In total, this means, according to this ranking, this building lands on the last place in late game usefulness and on the third last place in the early game usefulness, which gives it a solid last place ranking. Next on the list we have the Incan Estate, which provides a trickle of 0.8 coin per second after researching the 500 wood, 500 food and 500 coin big button upgrade. The cost is so insanely high for such a small bonus that in Supremacy this building basically never breaks even. So unless you are in a 1 hour grind or you build 5 estates anyway, then it's best to just ignore this upgrade. The payback time for the first estate with the upgrade is 40 minutes. Of course, if you add more estates, the upgrade investment gets smaller. But even then, you are at a break-even times of around 15 minutes for each newly constructed estate, which is super long in Supremacy. In late game, you can achieve a total of 8 coin per second with 10 estates, which is a bit more than one factory. So it's a nice bonus to have for Incas, which don't have access to a factory, but it's also not something broken. Remember, you still need to invest 6,000 wood and a lot of space in your base for that bonus. The next two on the list are the monastery and the church. I didn't include the other church-like buildings because they're basically all really similar. What's interesting about these is that a 75 higher wood cost of the monastery leads to a difference in break-even time of 1.5 minutes, over 6 minutes compared to under 5 minutes. This means the monastery is in the break-even area of a tavern and the church is pretty close to a top. or a shrine, which really is surprising to me, to be honest. I didn't expect them to be this good. In late game, both are pretty trash, so let's jump into the next. Next on the list, we have the Hacienda. The main issue with the Hacienda is the very high cost of 600 wood, while also having a low gather rate. So usually it's not worth it to build Haciendas in the early game for its full price. This gets offset by the fact that in late game the maximum gather rate is decent, with all upgrades affecting Haciendas and also cows being able to gather at Haciendas. In total, all Haciendas in late game are worth as much as 1.5 factories, which is decent, all things considered. Number 8 on the list, we have surprisingly the Cancha house, with a gather rate of 0.6 food per second. Cancha houses are decent in early game and decent in late game, but weak compared to other generating houses. They have the highest break-even time of all generating houses, with around 6 minutes break-even time. With shrines and torps, you have to take higher risks and build them outside of your base, which kind of balances it out. Higher risk should always give a higher reward than lower risk plays. I also want to point out that Inca's houses and estates combined provide a bigger bonus than 2 factories. Rank 7 are the trading posts on a trading route. In the early game it sits rightfully on the second place. The break-even time, even without upgrades, is so low that it almost always is worth it to get an TP, if your build allows it and you can defend it. This also explains why build orders with Stagecoach TP are still and always have been good, since Stagecoach basically doubles the gather rate of TPs from 1.2 XP per second to 2.0 resource per second. Playing with TPs is a high risk, high reward kind of playstyle. If you upgrade it and you lose your TPs and the enemy builds it, not only do you lose your economy, your enemy also benefits from your investment. So it's a disaster on 2 fronts. This building places so low on this list because in late game it's difficult to secure multiple TPs and the benefit is noticeable, but also not as big as in the early game. For the calculation, I assumed you can hold on to 3 trading posts with Iron Horse, each TP providing 2.4 wood per second. The methodology I chose puts the TP lower than it really should be. TPs in the late game are worth it, and if you manage to secure all 3 TPs on Enders, for example, you almost get another factory. Coming up next are the Japanese dojo. I know most people will say, what is this building? I've never seen anyone use this, so why is it so high on this list? Dojos provide surprisingly high value in late game and pay back relatively quickly in early game. Because I made a separate video about dojos already, I will only talk about the recent changes. Now when you are population blocked, the dojo will wait until you have free population space and then immediately train the units. Also, now dojos can be rebuilt with heroes. For the analysis, I assumed that one dojo does cost around 1000 food because an average Fortress 8 shipment is worth around 1000 food and you need to send a shipment to access dojos. This means it pays back once it trained 2 armies, which for Yumis it means it pays back in around 4 minutes. Because dojos also get affected by several upgrades, like the dojo upgrade, the Tokugawa shogunate wonder, and immigrants, and you can get 2 dojos, they are on paper surprisingly good even in late game. They're actually similar in value to factories on wood. I think they're actually viable now. The only thing holding them back is that they are located in age 3 and need 2 separate cards. These are the main reasons we don't see more dojo play in my opinion. 2 more ideas to make them even more viable. Make both dojo cards a ×2 card, keep one of them in age 3, the other dojo card moves to age 4 and also researches the dojo upgrade upon sending. The maximum dojo limit should be 2, so putting in both of these cards doesn't do much. This way you would enable dojos in Supremacy and also in Treaty, since it doesn't block important Fortress Age slots anymore and also only need 1 deck slot. Next on the list we have the shrines. I did a video on shrines already, so I'll only quickly talk about the changes. Even with the latest nerfs of -5% gather rate and lower building hit points, shrines still have a low break-even time of 5.5 minutes and high late game scaling. It is not as good as it used to be, but it is in line with similar house gathering buildings. Speaking about house gathering buildings, next up we have the torps. Tops gather 0.3 food per second from bushes, 0.27 from mines, and up to 0.25 for trees, if 5 trees are close to a top. For early game, I assumed you build them close to a mine. For late game, I assume you send the H4 woodcart. Overall, they provide good early game bonuses and decent late game bonuses. Keep in mind, in the early game with good herding and livestock, singular torps also can give a bit more resources and thus lower break-even times than shown. Also, torps gather and deplete natural resources. So that is also a big difference to shrines and country houses, which means the higher rates are somewhat justified. In long games, top gather rates go down as trees and mines dwindle and also require blackberry shipment from time to time. All in all, torps seem to be on a similar power level as other houses with their own little twist. Starting the top 3 list are the factories. Factories are actually the only building on this list which are not rebuildable, so if you lose them, they are gone for good. Assuming the average cost of an H4 shipment of 1600 food, they pay back in 3.5 minutes. In addition to that, they provide access to heavy artillery, which are super difficult to stop, especially in supremacy. It used to start the production cycle without giving a cannon, if you didn't have population space. This is now changed and the factory will wait until you have free population, and then spawn a heavy cannon. Other than that, they haven't changed much over the years, so for further info check out my other video about factories. The second best building is the bank. Besides the factory or the dojo, this is the only building which is solely built for their coin gathering and doesn't provide another bonus like population space. Banks also only can be built by the Dutch, which in turn only can have 60 villagers. Banks define the playstyle of Dutch with their relatively low payback time of only 4 minutes and their high late game potential. Banks alone give as much gather bonus as the 2 following places combined, with a maximum of 2500 food equivalent per minute. This is the same bonus as having 22 shrines and 20 torps. According to this methodology, the best economic building currently in the game is the University of Hausa. For the university payback time calculation, I assumed that you can build it close to a TC and a palace in the early game. With these assumptions, the university pays back the fastest of any building with only 3 minutes payback time. Keep in mind that similar to the trading posts, it's hard to continue to boom with universities, since you need to invest steadily into more buildings and map control. I think the best interpretation of this data is that there is nothing that pays back as fast as a well-placed university, but you can't place a lot of well-placed universities. For the late game, I assumed that an average university generates 2 influence per second, which means that most are close to a TC and a palace, and some even to a trading post. In late game, universities provide around as much value as 2 factories, which seems reasonable. This combination in the early game utility, while also being decent in late game, places university on number 1. Now to the closing remarks. With this analysis, I wanted to put the different economic buildings into perspective, compare the power level and also judge if there are any secret games. What surprised me the most is the low payback times of churches and trading posts. If you can sneak them into your build order, they can help start an economic snowball. Dojos again are surprisingly good, but get held back mainly by the fact that the units have to walk to the front and also by the huge amount of essential Fortress Age cards for Japanese already. For late game civilizations, which have buildings with high gathering potential, they are typically offset by lower villager numbers or the lack of factories. To judge if something is overpowered, you would have to analyze the total late game economy, including villagers, endless cards and other game mechanics. Maybe I do that in the future video, but it's also out of scope for this video since there are a lot of variables and combinations. I will also leave the spreadsheet in the info box, so you can see yourself in detail my assumptions and also play around with the assumptions and see how that changes the result. Thanks for watching this video. Let me know in the comments what surprised you the most about the buildings. I know I skipped some buildings, for example the Lombard or the Basilica or the Cathedral. I don't think you would build the Basilica or the Cathedral for the XP anyway, so that's why I skipped those. And the Lombard I will cover in a future video. So, thanks for watching, have great holidays and see you guys around. Bye bye!